I'm very happy to welcome three scholars and colleagues today. My first welcoming will be to Alberta Di Giuli, will be our keynote speaker. And also I'll be also happy to welcome, Bram van der Past, who's coming from Maastricht University, and Minh Nguyen. Just to give few words concerning the school, we are Grande École, meaning that we are pretty much a sort of French university with a form of special selection process. We are welcoming about 2,000 students, permanent 2,000 students per year, and we have a team of researchers of 30 people. We've got an important finance department, and that was somehow the yes. We've got two campuses, Paris and Orléans, and we've got a set of interesting programs. Most of our research is directed towards addressing a set of crucial issues in the context of sustainability, addressing not only finance, but also anything dealing with societal issues. As for me, I'm a scholar in gender applied to entrepreneurship. So that's a pretty important issue, dealing with masculinities and femininities in the entrepreneurial culture. As you can see a set of figures and numbers concerning and information data concerning our school. And we've got also an important international mission. I'm now trying to recall why we organize this session. We do believe that we need somehow to inaugurate a new era in terms of research, addressing critical issues and using critical approach in business. That's why we thought, that's why, go down.
No, the other one.
I'd like to move to go to the next slide.
Next slide, please.
Yes, again, yes, a slide later, please. Can we go a little bit further? Yes, further. Further, no, yes. Oh. Part 2. I'd like to introduce FBNet. It doesn't go down, it goes further on. Part 2, oh yes, of course. Then, of course, in order to organize this event, we worked with an important network, and I would like to welcome the whole community of Finance Banking Network. The members of this community are online today and also in the room. Go a little bit down. This network is an important network that is working on several issues. Down?
No, next slide, just that.
Slide don't go, yes.
So next one I will introduce about
Next one, please.
Next slide, please. Voila. There is an important vision in philosophy concerning this finance banking network, and maybe I let Professor Tam to present it properly, as I know a set of things concerning the network, but that would be nice that you could say a few words.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Reynolds. And I would like to introduce about FBNet. So, FBNet is a finance and banking network of FBNet Global with the participation of many Vietnamese academics and
Tam, I can hear you well.
He has been muted.
Can you hear me? Sorry, can you hear me? Everyone, can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Yes, we do. But I think with the other, we should keep it muted, right?
Okay, so let me continue. So let me continue with the introduction about our network FBNet. So FBNet is a finance and banking network of FBNet Global with the participation of many Vietnamese academics and practitioners around the world. Our network, see this one. Our network vision and philosophy is to level up international cooperation in research for Vietnamese scholars and in business for Vietnamese practitioners. We aim to develop multiple platforms to learn, to share, and exchange knowledge and skill for Vietnamese and international scholars and practitioners through collaboration. FBNet, therefore, will support to improve individuals' profiles of members and collaborators. In terms of activities, FBNet focus on 4 main activities, including research, advisory works, conference and workshop, and capacity buildings. Regarding research, FBNet creates a platform for exchanging research ideas, experience, and skill through organizing many research seminars, webinars, database on research areas, and research skill of network participants. We also support research of our members through discussion, ideas, network publication, or research fund calling. In terms of conference and workshop, FBNet proudly organize annual international conference, for example, Vietnamese Symposium in Banking and Finance since 2016. We also organize another conference such as International Society for Advancement of Financial Economics since 2022. And this year we are going to organize Vietnam's Symposium in Climate Transition. We also organize series of workshops such as research methods or current practice in banking and finance industry to create a platform for audience and members to discuss. FBNet also provide advisory work to many organizations and governments like Vietnamese government or OECD. In order to sustain the development of FBNet, we organize many training workshops to support our members' development. And we organize monthly or quarterly training workshops related to research and other current topics in banking finance. Last but not least, FBNet is proud of two representatives who actively contribute to the seminar organization, Ms. Nga Nguyen, doctoral researcher from Dresden University, Germany, and Dr. Thuy Dao, assistant professor in finance, FBNet Business School, present at ISC Paris today to support the conference. Okay.
Thank you, Tâm Nguyễn. So now we would like to welcome the speaker to present their paper. First of all, our keynote speaker, Alberta Digili, full professor of finance at ESCP Business School, France. Her research focus on corporate governance, corporate social responsibility, climate finance, and media coverage. Her paper today will highlight the climate change and fund management relationship. Please show her presentation, please.
Okay, wait me 1 second.
Change the. We want to change the long slides. Yeah, we can change it. Not this one. Cái bài no, share screen. Không, cái bài đầu tiên của mình.
Can you see the new screen now?
Yeah, please wait.
Je sais, mais non.
We show these verbs. So, in a nutshell, we are facing climate change and we have to start addressing that. And in order to do so, we need to do something. As economists, as investors, one way how we can go about that is by allocating our portfolio to more sustainable firms. And in practice, this is precisely what you see. So if you take a look at this graph over here, which may be more difficult to see on the slides, but you see a large increase in the amount of assets under management invested by socially responsible investors. In the US, this is about a third. In Europe, this is 50 to 60%. So there's a large willingness of these investors to invest responsibly. And they do so using environmental, social, and governance issues. As you can see on the slide, it's not just one single benchmark, like with firm profitability. You look at the accounting profits or the stock market performance, there's a lot of stuff going on here. But in terms of ESG, there's even within environment, there's climate change, natural resources, pollution, waste, and then you have the energy aspect. So there's a lot of things that we have to consider simultaneously as investor in a socially responsible firm or fund. Now, what you get, because there's so much information out there, you basically get a market for lemon type of scenario where you don't know exactly what each firm is doing. And this makes it difficult for investors to allocate their money. Now, what they do in practice is that there are these companies like MSCI that uses all of this information and tries to put it together in one score that makes socially responsible investing accessible to a broader public. This is, in essence, a very good thing to do because you and I don't have a whole financial engineering department that can look at all of these firms trying to figure out which one is good and which one is bad. So give us a proxy that should reasonably work, and we should be good with that. But the underlying assumption is this proxy should work. Now, in theory, socially responsible investing is just like normal investing, but you just have a utility function that uses the sustainable performance of firms. So it's not just financial, but you also consider a trade-off between their sustainable performance. If I'm investing in Shell, I would definitely want more returns because the firm is doing really badly. If I'm investing in Tesla, I'm willing to accept a lower return because the firm is reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In essence, it works like that. And there are two ways how we can go about that. The first one is just mentioned before is engagement. I, as an investor, target a firm, try to change it from within. The other alternative is portfolio tilting. I either sell the bad firms and or buy the good firms. And I basically change the weight in my portfolio. And that has a large impact, we hope, in practice. But we don't know for sure. Now, it looks something like this. We start off with a whole bunch of brown investors, a couple of green firms, a couple of brown firms, and a cost of capital of about 5%. Now, suddenly, these investors turn green. Then what do? Is they tilt their portfolio towards the sustainable firms, towards the green factories. And then what happens is that these factories will effectively be facing a lower cost of capital. So the cost of capital goes down because they have more access to it and investors are willing to forgo some returns. Then as a result, these green firms will grow more quickly in equilibrium than the brown firms. And the share of green assets in the economy goes up. That's theoretically how this should work. Now, in practice, ESG information is very opaque. We don't know for sure how everything is working, whether it works, whether these investors actually invest this way, and investors don't know for sure how sustainable each firm is. But they do rely on these ESG ratings, as has been shown by a JF article. Now, when these investors don't know for sure, and these ratings are very often used, as a firm, you have the incentive to increase your rating, but not necessarily your sustainable performance. This is what we call ESG rating inflation, and that's what the paper of today is about. So you'd like to basically get an artificially high ESG rating to attract more investors to your firm, which is a plausible system. And it looks something like this. Green investors don't know which is which. They use the rating and hope it's the green one. Now, what we find is that effectively it's more like this. The ones with the higher rating are the ones that are actually doing worse and worse. in the future so, because of their cost of capital. This paper therefore contributes basically to finding that these ESG ratings are inflated. It shows that these investors are using them and are going into the wrong firms. And as a third thing, it looks at the cost of capital reductions that these firms experience. So ESG ratings don't seem to work. Investors follow the ones with the higher rating. And as a result, they give incentives to brown firms as opposed to green firms. This contributes to this whole debate on what works better. Is the engagement story good, or is it more portfolio tilting? And well, effectively, if there's a lot of information asymmetry, engagement is most likely going to work better than portfolio tilting, because at least you don't tilt away from the wrong firms. You might accidentally target the ones less sustainable, but that's still good because you're probably going to get an incremental improvement on them, whichever one that you pick. But with tilting, it can go the other way, as we show here. And it contributes to the ESG rating literature, which is basically a body of research that looks at how these ratings work, whether they differ. And we show that some of them are inversely related to sustainable performance altogether, which questions their use in practice and in academia. So, roadmap. Step 1, we segregate what firms do and what firms are promising to do. This we call promises and realizations, and we do so using granular data. Subsequently, we use these promises and realizations to figure out which firms are having inflated ESG ratings. Then we look at the actual portfolios of institutional investors, and we find that they follow these firms with the wrong ratings. And last, we look at a causal shock to ESG rating inflation to show that this actually has cost of capital implications. So we use this Refinitiv ESG data, which are basically 500 granular aspects of sustainable performance from 2003 to 2022. We've just updated the sample. It's not yet in the slides, but it works in that time span as well. And this covers about 85% of global market cap. So it's not just firms in the US or Europe. We have firms in Africa, Latin America, Asia, literally every continent we have firms in. And it's therefore very representative and from a relatively long period of time. So just taking a look at the data, just on the emission side, we do not just have how much a firm emits in terms of greenhouse gases, but we know whether they have policies on them. We know whether they have targets, whether they do emission trading, whether they have initiatives to reduce their emission. And this we can effectively split into two different parts. You have the promises part, that is part of reporting policies, activities, and targets. And you have the realizations, which is what they're actually doing, and controversies on similar topics. Basically, input and output. What does a firm say it's going to do, and what does it actually do moving forward? And we use a method used in medicine to measure diabetes, and we reformed that in a non-parametric rank ordering mechanism that allows us to compare this by firm, basically for all of the firms in a similar industry and or in a similar point in time. We use both specifications, results don't change. So we argue that these ratings don't work if two conditions hold. First, the ratings only capture the promises and not the realizations, which in itself is a really strong condition, because there needs to be basically no influence of what you do on what your rating is like. And subsequently, these promises cannot realize moving forward. Because if they would, then promising a lot now would mean a lot of future sustainable performance. So it would make sense that your rating is higher right now. And well, let me show you what we find. So on average, we find that the Refinitiv, MSCI, and FBNet-ISC ESG ratings are strongly positively related to the promised ranks that we have. So if you promise more, your rating goes up, which is understandable. Even in a scenario where ratings are completely accurate, you want this to happen, because a firm that does nothing and promises to do a lot versus a firm that does nothing and also promises not to do anything, well, the first one should certainly be seen as better than the latter. But if you look at the realizations, it's often negative to neutral. So firms that do a lot seem to be penalized in their rating. There are a couple of explanations for why this might happen. One of them could be that firms that are in a bad scenario right now, they suddenly had a controversy on one of their production sites, and they want to fix that. And therefore, they start reporting a lot and promising a lot of things moving forward because they had some bad event happen. And subsequently, they just don't realize it. Another thing is that the firms that are doing really well might want to hide part of their production process for proprietary reasons. If it's something very common, like using recyclable bottles or buying green energy, certainly you can say that. That doesn't change your production process. But if it's something hidden, then that's maybe more difficult. Yes.
So only they realize that all alternatives, not that they realize are the ones that match the promised ones. So they are both alternative, right?
At this regression, yes. Okay. At the next one, I will show you in more detail. So let's look through a practical example. I presume that most of you have had a beer at least once. And it's quite likely that the beer has been from Heineken, which is a really large beer brewing company. Now, what happened in 2006 is that they had massive problems related to their supply chain in Cambodia. They basically gave their sales workers a wage that was about half the livable amount, no contracts, no tertiary benefits, for which as a result, mainly women were somewhat forced into prostitution there because they earned such a low wage they needed to sustain themselves. And as they were selling beer, they also turned to alcoholism quite frequently. This is horrible. This should not have happened, but it did. And what you saw in that period of time, which is gray shaded here, is that during the time, the performance of the firm went down a lot, the sustainable performance. But the promises went up, stayed high. And as a result, the rating actually increased during this period of time. So when there were very bad negative events, the rating of Heineken, ESG rating, went up because it was reporting extensively on these issues.
Excuse me, something is quite bizarre because we have a feeling that even when firms are doing well on sustainable environment and this sort of ESG things, the ranking, I mean, they are penalized by the ranking, and this is not clear. It was 2 slides before you advance. That was not clear to me why they are penalized. Even the nice firms are penalized as well. This is very bizarre.
It is. And there are different types of reasonings for that. So there is this JFI, financial intermediation paper, that argues that these rating agencies might not have the incentive to accurately monitor. There's a lot of information asymmetry, and why should they put in the effort to accurately measure this? There's another paper in Journal of Business Ethics 2021, Clementino and Perkins, which argues that these firms can go to the rating agency and request rating methodology workshops at a very high price tag to subsequently improve their ratings. There's a similar mechanism shown by Becker and Badhai in JFE 2018 for credit ratings in India.
We could have a more simple explanation saying that if their ranking is not good, it is because in fact they don't do a lot. Or not enough.
That could be, but there should be a positive relationship between the ranking and what they do, right? But that's not what I find across multiple rating agencies. So it seems not to be directionally correct. And yeah, so in aggregate, what happens if we just basically plot that? What happens if we look at the promises here at time t, this should be the promise, and whether firms actually realize these promises moving forward. And what we effectively find is there's generically a negative relationship between the promises that you make and the realizations that you have. So if you're promising to do more on, say, energy consumption, you're probably not actually going to change your behavior. So the ones that shout out the most appear to be the ones that to be doing the least. There is some variance in that. In terms of water waste management and business model resilience, which is closely tied to cash flows, you do find this effect. And when we updated our sample to 2022, we found that there's more realizations in the more recent sample than that there was in the older sample. And funnily enough, you see a really big transition effect for greenhouse gas emissions. At the start of the sample, from 15 to 8 years, say after something happened, we found after firms started promising we found that there is basically a negative relationship between how much they promise and how much they do. Between 8 and say 4 years ago, when you look at the same effect, you find that this effect is neutral. And in the last 3, or in the new sample, 5 years, you find that promising more actually reduces your greenhouse gas emissions. But this effect is still economically very small. So for a 1 standard deviation increase in promises, the realizations go up by somewhere in the league of 0.03 to 0.1, depending on exactly which specification you look at. And this effect is generically robust across continent, across time, across industry, across everything I could actually think of, unfortunately. The effects are slightly worse in Asia, slightly better in Europe, but it's pretty robust. Now, let's take a look at what happens. Are these firms, these investors, actually fooled by the ratings? And we do so in the following way. So we basically look at these 13F filings, which shows you by firm which institutional investors are buying that firm on a quarterly basis by Thomson Reuters. And then we basically split that by the share of institutional investors and the share of institutional investors that sign a treaty, the principle of responsible investing by the United Nations to invest in a socially responsible manner. And in aggregate, what you find is that a higher rating means more institutional investor coverage, which is kind of to be expected. These are larger firms, usually with ratings. There's some flow there. But if you split this up, you find that it's particularly those that are promised to invest responsibly that are buying the ones with the higher ratings. And the ones that are not promising to invest responsibly are moving out of these firms. They're selling their assets. Now, you can split this up further in promises and realizations by part. And you find that it's particularly the promises that firms make that attract investors, not necessarily the realization. For those that sign the PRI, this effect is rather sizable. In total, institutional investors that sign the PRI hold about 11 to 13% of the global market cap of these firms. What we find is that if a firm starts from not reporting anything to completely reporting on ESG issues, these PRI investors acquire 3.7 percentage points of their market cap, which is basically a 30% increase in their portfolio in these firms. Recording in process, I hope. And they also seem to sell out of the firms with more realizations. And this is really big. So let's replicate this. Let's make a portfolio ourselves based on common portfolio procedures. And what we find is that if we buy the 10% highly rated firms in an industry, we see that their controversies are on average basically 3 times more likely than by just buying the market. So it's really quite prominent. To give you an example, Shell has an ESG rating by Refinitiv of 93 out of 100. There are more firms like that where there are questionable outcomes. And in aggregate, this effect is also rather persistent. This is just a calibration. It's not that important for part of the story, but just to give a feeling of how big is it, what's really happened. So, step 1, ratings don't seem to work. Step 2, investors seem to be fooled by the ratings. Now, step 3, do firms gain and grow more quickly? Do they have a lower cost of capital when the ratings are off? In equilibrium, if we just use a usual regression analysis that's not causal and pretty plain vanilla, we find that there's a generic reduction in cost of capital when firms have a higher ESG rating. And this uses multiple measures given in the literature. But we need to find a causal shock to this. And honestly, good luck finding one. We need to find a shock to basically rating inflation. That is something that these firms try to hide, the same as the rating agencies. And we managed to find one of these shocks. And we found this in the non-financial reporting directive of the European Union. So in 2014, the EU announced that all large interest public firms needed to report more strongly on their sustainable performance. Report, but not increase the performance. So reporting goes up, performance stays the same, which effectively translates in an artificial shock in these ESG ratings because of the relationship of promises and realizations. We figured out that it should work like this, and then we got a message from these authors who just published a paper in Journal of Accounting Research that uses that shock for precisely that reason. So we can now also use it, and we have something nice to back it up with. And what we do is we look at firms in Switzerland versus firms in Austria and Germany, because Switzerland is not part of the EU. So it forms a perfect treatment and control group. Because Austrian and German firms are very similar to Swiss firms. They're both somewhat German speaking, they both have a similar culture, they both have similar ESG performance beforehand. And what we can just do is take a look at what happens after the introduction of the shock and after the announcement of the shock. And we find that there's very large reductions when this NFDR happens on the firms that are treated. So we find that these reductions are approximately 85 basis points in terms of cost of capital, which is incredibly sizable compared to a 400 basis point cost of capital in total. I've done some calibrations on this. I think numbers more closely aligning to 35 basis points are more representative, but we still find these relatively high numbers. So there seems to be a sizable impact, an incentive for firms to inflate these ratings. So in a nutshell, we show that Refinitiv, MSCI, and FBNet-ISC ESG ratings are inversely related to sustainable performance. That these investors are tilting their portfolios based on these ratings, and that as a result, there is a causal impact on cost of capital for these firms. And this might question the effectiveness of portfolio tilting in practice because of information asymmetries. So yeah, it's really challenging the debate on how to invest responsibly. If we're all using the ratings, are we making the right calls? Are we divesting from the right firms and giving advantages to the right firms on the other side of the sustainability spectrum? And therefore, we need to basically consider these questions. How can we address this? All that I have been able to think of is to improve the reporting. So if there's a standardized reporting framework like an IFRS or a US GAAP for sustainability, it might reduce innovation, but it would also increase information transparency, which might allow investors to more easily invest based on actual numbers of the firms as opposed to ESG ratings. And in the current setting, should we be using these ratings in the first place? Honestly, I don't know. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation. If you have any questions, ask them to me right now or send me an email. And if you'd like to read up on the paper or any of my other work, just scan the QR codes and you'll be there right away. Thank you so much. And I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Bram. It's very interesting study. I think now we open for questions from audience on site and online. Very interesting. There's a question online from Martin that for what I know, MSCI use AI to get a score. What do you think about using AI, high energy consumption, to get a rating score for ESG? Should MSCI have a low score itself on the environment?
Could you quickly repeat that? So you wanted to use AI and energy data to make the ESG scores?
Yeah. So what do you think about using AI, high energy consumption, to get a rating score for ESG? Should MSCI have a low score itself on the environment?
Well, there are many things to consider here. So using AI or more detailed measures to measure environmental social performance is always a good thing to do, given that it's understandable what's happening. But if you're just looking at energy data, then you're only capturing this part of the complete ESG picture of the firm. And MSCI or Refinitiv do include energy data by default. They have this information in their data set. So there are many energy usage or emissions providers nowadays. So there seems to be something going on in that direction already.
I think Martel raised hand there. So
yes, the question was mine. The question was that since from what I know, the MCI already use AI to get the ESG score. So they do with AI all the calculation. So basically they give a score to small company or medium company or big company using AI. So they consume a lot of electricity, a lot of scope 1 or scope 2 depending on the point, and they contribute to emission to get the scoring on ESG on the other company. That's what do you think about that? Because using technology from one side might give better understanding of ESG, but from other side, it contribute to the higher emission.
Thank you, Matteo. I had some small difficulty hearing your question, but if I get it correctly, you mentioned that there were some drawbacks of using AI in terms of using rating, in terms of constructing ratings.
I'm trying to, it's not, yes, there are some drawback for at least in my opinion, but the question is about use AI. AI consume a lot of energy to get ESG ratings. So basically, to do something, align company to the track of climate path, you consume a lot by deviating.
Oh, that's marginal. I can run AI programs on my laptop. That's really not a big concern. I've used AI in some of my own studies before. The energy usage of a firm and their investing compared to the energy using an AI program are really marginal. That's just, you can simply just as good as open up a couple of Excel files. It's almost as heavy. That's not a concern. So just to give you an example, right? How are they doing this in practice? So what Refinitiv does is they basically collect a large amount of information. I use their actual information. Then they group it in topics. And then they somehow take a weighted average of that. And then they put it into a rating. So they say 20% to emissions. I'm just making up the numbers, check the file to make sure. 20% on water use, some 20% on human rights. And then they group the policies, activities and targets, and the promises and controversies in one group. And because of that, they aggregate this information basically. And this is how their methodology allows for the mismatch between promises and realizations. Thank you.
Any other question?
I just got a question from the audience here is how do we measure the realized sustainable performance?
Yeah.
So what we have this very detailed information from one of the rating providers that captures most of this information. So I actually know what the pay gap of men and women is in a firm, how much employment they create, how much emissions they have on NOx, SOx, CO2, particulate matter. I know how much water they use, how much energy they use. I really have this actual information, and I can, in the later analysis, I really one-to-one map that to the promises that they have.
Where is the ESG when it comes more than the deliveries? I mean, I mentioned when it's
I actually haven't checked it like that. I've split it up by subparts, like human rights, nitrogen emissions in parts like that. CO2 is starting to change. They're really starting to seriously come through on their promises. And nitrogen and SOx a lot less. Energy use is not really happening yet, but at least they're trying to reduce their first scope emissions. And in terms of human rights, you just don't see much as of yet. I'm now rerunning the results using the 22 data to check whether that changed, because I think it will be. I think it will have. I hope it has, because then there will be improvements for society in that regard.
Maybe these are like the things that take time. Because then they realize versus promise, it could be a big time. If I want to change raw energy, then it might take, even if I want to, because of the big strains or something, that
it certainly takes time.
While, for example, you can, let's use the pay gap. That's something that is easier.
Yeah, you just change the contract, give people more money, they'll never say no, and then everyone's happy. So because of that, I basically look at the promises right now, on the realizations up to 15 years ahead. So I do 15. So I carefully track that. I basically look at what you promise right now, and then every year I run a new regression. So T+1, T+2, T+, etc. to gain the sample as large as possible. And therefore I can basically calculate these curves where when and promises made how long ago have now impact on realizations, basically. Or if I make a promise right now, in the future, T+ something periods from now, do I realize? And that does not seem to be happening that much. So you're completely right in pointing out that it takes a long time. Precisely for that reason, I want to extend the sample another 2 years, because stuff probably has changed since Paris and probably has changed since the financial crisis in 2008 and 9. So I want to make sure that I have enough observations in the recent period to make plausible predictions on that. But yes, that's something we try to address in that issue, but it just seems to be not that much happening. Waste management, yes. Something related to greenhouse gas emissions, but that's pretty much where it stops right now.
Yep, thank you very much, Bram. I think due to the time, so you had to keep more questions at the end at the Q&A session. Thanks again for very interesting study. Now we welcome our third presentation by Minh Nhật Nguyen from Deakin University in Australia. He will present a very interesting paper titled Navigating Climate Uncertainty, Clean Tech versus Fossil Fuel ETF. Over to you, Minh Nhật, when you are ready.
Hello, so can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, thank you.
You can share
my
your screen. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Can you see my slide?
Yeah, we can see and hear you clearly now.
Okay, good. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for having me today to present my research. So it is my one of my papers from my thesis. So I'm Minh Nhật Nguyen. I'm a PhD student at the Deakin University, and so okay, let's see. Yes, so this is the joint work with my supervisor, Dr. Rubin, and so the paper is the title is Navigating Climate Uncertainty or Clean Tech versus Fossil Fuel ETF. So basically, if you see from title in the paper, we do very straightforward thing. We compare the clean ETF or clean renewable ETF to the fossil fuel ETF in terms of returns and risk. So in this paper, we focus on the energy industry because energy industry is so important in the combat against climate change. Okay, let's move on to the motivation of the paper. So climate risk are so important nowadays. So many papers show that the investors care more about the climate risk recently. And so the big question is whether I think the concern is what is the good hedge against climate risk? And many people argue that the green assets, for example, the renewable energy stock, can be the good hedge against climate risk. And during high periods of the climate risk, like the brown stock, like the fossil fuel, will perform worse or perform badly during the climate risk. So, and in our paper, we do the empirical test to see whether green assets can outperform brown or clean energy stock or ETF can outperform fossil fuel ETF during high periods of the climate risk. So empirical literature show the mixed evidence. Some papers show that the green can outperform brown. some papers show the brown can outperform green. And so most of empirical evidence is unconditional. So, and theory paper comes out to explain the pressure in the performance between the green and brown. In our paper, we focus on the theoretical model proposed by the Basel et al. 2021 published in the JFE. So the theoretical model shows that the green can outperform brown in times when there are unexpected shifts in the customer taste for the green product and investor taste for green assets. However, unconditionally, brown will outperform green because in the long run, green assets are more expensive than the brown assets because of the high demand for the green assets, hedging against the climate risk. So theory shows that we can see the green can outperform brown in the conditional testing. So that's why we set up a conditional test to see whether clean energy ETF can outperform brown energy ETF during conditional on the climate information. So now it's my overview of the findings. So basically, we find that unconditionally, no difference between the green and brown, or no difference between the clean energy and fossil fuel energy ETF in terms of the risk and return. However, when we incorporate climate information into the test, we can see clean energy ETFs outperform brown fossil fuel ETFs. For example, during the high natural disaster period or high climate policy uncertainty, clean energy ETF will have a higher return, risk-adjusted returns than a fossil fuel ETF or fossil fuel portfolio. So, and one more thing is during the high climate risk period, brown portfolio is riskier than green. So, for example, the fossil fuel or brown portfolio will have a higher market risk or higher downside risk or idiosyncratic risk than clean energy ETF. So our paper emphasizes the state dependence of the fossil and clean energy ETF in terms of the risk and return, and the results has important implication for investors who want to hedge climate risk. So as I mentioned before, there are many empirical studies working on the green and brown stocks, and findings are mixed. Some papers show the green can outperform brown, but some papers show the opposite result. So it is a theoretical paper we follow to form our hypothesis. So we focus on the Basel et al. Paper. So in that paper, they show that the green will outperform brown when we have a high concern about climate risk, because the high concern about the climate risk will affect stock price through the customer channel and investor channel. So during the high climate risk period, green firms will have positive unexpected return, but brown firms will have a negative unexpected return. So this is what theory mentioned. So we form four hypotheses. The first one, we look at we want to test the returns of the green and brown portfolio conditional on the climate information. And for the hypothesis 2A and 2B, we look at the market beta and downside risk beta of the green and brown portfolio. And the last one, we look at the ideal syncretic risk between the brown and green portfolio. So methodology, we start with the null. So we start with the null hypothesis. That's the return of the brown minus return the green greater than 0. So, and then we incorporate the information of the instruments into the equation. And for example, in our paper, we use 2 instruments. The first one is a natural disaster, and the second one is policy uncertainty. So we incorporate instruments into the equation, and we see whether we can reject the null hypothesis or not. If we reject the null hypothesis, we can conclude that the green outperform brown. Okay, so this is a methodology we use in our paper. So we, so basically we have 2 instruments. So we have a system of the some moment conditions. So and then we do the John test to see whether we can reject the null hypothesis or not. Okay, so and we use the same method for the market beta to test the market beta and downside risk beta and ideal syncretic risk. So let's see the data. So in data for the instruments, we use 2 instruments. The first one is natural disaster data, and the second one is the climate policy uncertainty index. For the green portfolio, so in our paper, we focus on energy industry. So green portfolio, we use 4 clean energy ETFs. So they are the top ETFs under the asset management to form our green portfolio. So we form the equally weighted portfolio. So for the brown portfolio, we call it brown portfolio because we use the fossil fuel ETF to form the portfolio. So they are the top portfolio, top ETF under the asset management. So to form the instrument, so we have 2 types of the instruments. The first one is a dummy, and the second one is a magnitude-based instrument. So dummy means for example, if the number of natural disasters is higher than the median of the number of natural disasters during the sample, the instrument will test value of 1 and 0 otherwise. And then we normalize the instrument by mean. So similarly for the magnitude-based instruments, we test the difference between the value of instrument and the median to take into account the impact of the magnitude on the test. So again, for the dummy, similar to dummy, we normalize the instrument, the magnitude-based instrument by mean. Okay, let's move on to the results. So firstly, we look at the unconditional comparison. So unconditional means we just take the average and we do the t-test to see whether the result is significant or not. So the green and brown portfolio, so it's a risk-adjusted return. So for the green portfolio and brown portfolio have a negative return, and they are significant. So, but when we take the difference, so brown minus green, so the return of the different return is the negative 0.675. But the difference is not significant. So it means that no difference between the green and brown return unconditionally. Similarly, we can see no difference between the market beta of the green and brown and downside risk beta of the green and brown. So they are insignificant. So it means no difference in the market beta between green and brown. Additionally, we look at the fund flow. So to see the fund flow, so we see again, so no difference between the fund flow of the green and brown unconditionally. So P values are very high. So move on the main findings. So now we look at, we incorporate information on instruments into the test. And we see that we can reject null hypothesis. So it means that we can find the evidence that the green can outperform brown in the conditional test. You see the P value is significant at the 5%. And again, so we still see the evidence that the brown is still negative, but for the green portfolio, we cannot reject the null. So it means that for the green portfolio, we in the conditional test, we cannot find the evidence that the green is negative. So it means that during the high climate risk, we find the evidence that the green portfolio have a non-negative return. So this graph illustrates the result from the table 2. So you see unconditionally, the return of the green and brown are negative. But when we incorporate instrument, specifically when we incorporate the climate policy uncertainty information into the test, we see the green portfolio have a positive return. So that's why the green can outperform brown during the high policy uncertainty. So I think the result is consistent with the previous studies that show the regulation has an important impact on the green and brown stock. So let's move on the beta result. So again, for the beta result, so we see we find the evidence that the brown portfolio has a higher market beta during than the green portfolio under the conditional test. So the p-value is significant at 1% for the dummy and magnitude-based instruments. And this is a graph illustrating the result. So again, so when we incorporate climate policy uncertainty index into the test, we can see the market beta of the green portfolio decreases. So that's why in this case, the brown portfolio has a higher market beta than green portfolio. So, and another one is, so this is a downside risk beta result. So it means that during the high period return and during the high climate risk return, so the covariance between the negative return of the brown portfolio and negative return of the market return is higher than that of the green portfolio. So in general, so we can see the brown portfolio is riskier than the green portfolio during high climate risk. So, and the last one, we test the idiosyncratic risk. So again, so brown portfolio have a higher idiosyncratic risk than the green portfolio under conditional test or when we incorporate information related to climate into the test. And so we do some of the robustness tests, like we try the different instruments, or we use the returns adjusted by the cohort 4 factors or 5 factor models. The results are still robust. And another one, we try to see whether our results are driven by the economic condition or conditions such as a recession or not, because our sample is from the 2008 to 2021. So it is the recession period during the sample. So we test whether our results are driven by the economic condition or not. And we see that our results are still robust. So it means that so the performance of the green and brown portfolio of fossil fuel and clean energy ETF it's mainly driven by the climate information, like the climate policy and like our natural disaster. So we use the natural disaster like the transition risk and physical risk. So and we when we form the instrument, we use the median as a threshold. In the robustness check, we use the 75% quantile as a threshold, and we still get a significant result. And the magnitude of the test is larger. So, and we see, and we look at the fund flow. So we, and as I mentioned before, unconditionally, no difference between the fund flow of the green and brown ETFs. But when we look at conditional test, we can see the fund flow to the ETF is higher than fund flow to the brown ETF during the high climate risk. So it means that during the periods of the high climate risk, like the natural disaster or policy uncertainty period, the demand for the green ETF is higher than the brown ETF, or demand for the clean energy ETF is higher than the fossil ETF. So because maybe during that time, the demand for the hedging is high. So that's why it can explain our result why during that period, green can outperform brown. So in conclusion, so we see so we do the conditional test to see when green can outperform brown, or when fossil clean energy ETF can outperform fossil fuel ETF. And we also look at the risk of the fossil and clean energy. So our paper emphasizes the state dependence of the fossil and clean energy ETF. So the main findings is the green can outperform, so clean energy ETF can have a higher return than the fossil fuel ETF in the states of the high climate risk. And the fossil fuel ETF is riskier than the green ETF in these states. And so I think that result can provide some implication for investors who want to hedge against climate risk. So, okay, so that's all. Thank you for listening. Yep.
Thank you very much, Minh Nhật Nguyễn. Very interesting study and interesting finding as well. So we now open floor for audience to have questions. While we are waiting for question from audience, may I have a question? Because you use a period of in your sample from 2008 to 2021, it includes a global financial crisis period, and also for the climate change agreement signed in Paris in 2015. I'm not sure whether you consider those impact on the result.
Yes. Thank you for your question. So yes. So because during the, like for example, during the 2000 and I think the climate policy uncertainty index captures the period of the 2015, the Paris Agreement. So the index is high during that period. So for the the global crisis, so we use some data like the NPER, so rejection to test. So as I mentioned in the robustness check, we see whether our results are driven by the economic condition or not. So and we see they are not driven by the economic condition. So and then we try to put we test whether green can outperform brown conditional on period of the high climate risk and high and rejection, and we still see the green cane outperform. So it means that so what I want to say is the climate information is mainly driver of the result, not the economic condition. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ming. Is there any question from on-site and online audience?
I think we can also open the open question to all three papers which are somehow connected. So we can come back to those papers.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you, Zha. Due to the time, so we an open question for all our presenter. If you have a question in any presentation, feel free to ask. Let's see question from.
Yes, hi. I'm Ling. I have questions on the table, on the paper of Pram van der Kroft and on table 5.
Yeah.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead, please.
Okay. So yeah, in your presentation on table 5, the last table, and I found that they are variable named treated, and yeah, maybe I missed something, but I do not get the variable. And so can you tell me what this variable capture or measured? Yeah.
Yeah, so what I did there is I basically had it dummy, are you in Switzerland or are you in Austria and Germany? And if the NFDR, a non-financial reporting directive by the EU, being either announced in 2004 or actually being executed after 2017. And for both types of dummies, it works perfectly. There's about an 85% cost to capital difference. I calibrated this using the model, using a JFE 2021 model, Berken van Binsbergen, and there the estimate should be somewhere around 35 basis points. So our result is a little bit on the large side regarding that.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So it's control for the group in Australia or Germany who are the regulation or in the regulation affects. Okay.
Yes. So Switzerland, no regulation. Austria, Germany, regulated.
Thank
and
you.
then their cost of capital goes down.
I have also a question for Bram van der Kroft. Thank you very much for your very inspiring presentation. I'm not in finance, but in business ethics, and I found it very inspiring. I have a comment. The gap that you observe between the promises and the reality, it makes me think also about the environmental and social certification. For example, with ISO 14000, what is evaluated is the process, but not the results of the process. So you may also observe a gap between, it's not exactly promises, but in the end, you don't have usually the expected results of the process. So a company may have the certification and at the same time be a polluting companies. So I don't know if there is a link between the gap in the ESG rating and the gap in the way companies are managing environmental and social issues.
It's actually,
I don't know if we can draw a parallel.
well, I don't know, but I actually have the data. I could just run a regression and see. I have the data in my data set, so I'll take a look at it. Thank you. I didn't consider it, but yeah, it's very easily testable. Let's take a look. Well, if we're asking questions, then I'd like to ask a question to you. What I'm curious about, you're now looking at the investor perspective, but could you look at the firm perspective? Say that firms are facing a proposal and they are located, their headquarters is located in a period where there's a heat wave. Do you see like a withdrawal probability increase? That could be really cool, right? You have almost the entire setting to already test it. You just need to know where the headquarters of the firm is located. And then if they themselves feel suddenly more environmentally or socially friendly, which they didn't before because they didn't do it in private engagement, now they acquiesce and withdraw the proposal.
Okay, so that would imply that in the first place, there was no private engagement in the first place, right? Because then you can also claim that, well, if they were also aware of the climate change, then there would have been a private engagement. They should not have even arrived of it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, we have not looked at the withdrawn proposals. Yeah, sure, why not?
That will be close to the threshold, right? So if you, in private, either there was no private or then you didn't care, but now you suddenly do, then that might make the argument even stronger, I would probably. It's easy to test and pretty cool. I think you can then show it both ways.
Yeah, any other question? May I have a question in terms of RAM presentation, because you use an international database. So I'm not sure whether you consider the impact of cultural factor or in different country or legal system.
I have done that in another paper. It's actually the paper before this. So I look at basically some antecedents of CSR or ESG performance. So what tries to drive that? And I basically split it up by type of industry, where there's either innovation possible, there are consumer relations or not, and where there is a different type of legal framework, and also whether it's a developed or a still developing country. And what I find is that this pressure is not always one-sided. So often the pressure pushes firms that are in the middle, doing a bit risk mitigatively more towards the strategic side, but also it forces some into greenwashing. Because if the pressure from society goes up sufficiently high or much, then firms need to start doing something. Some of them can't, and then they actually also reduce in their sustainable performance. On average, about 2/3 shifts from risk mitigative to strategic, and about 1/3 from risk mitigative to greenwashing. And that effect evens itself very carefully out. It's almost nothing if you actually look at it after that.
So I have a last question. No, it's last. So I have a question. So there's a paper, I forgot by whom, that shows that brown firms are the ones that develop more green patents.
Yeah.
But then maybe this helps reconcile your results, right? So maybe you're brown, but you're doing innovation in green. Have you control for this? Check this?
Not explicitly, I must admit. All of the comparisons that I have are within industry. So I compare Shell with BP and Chevron, but not with Apple.
Yeah.
Because to slightly alleviate that, but I have some measure of spending green expenditure and green R&D, but it's just very empty in the data. There's just a lot of missing, so it's hard to truly interpret that. So it's a good third-party measure. Let me write that down. Thank you.
I can find the title of the. I mean, I'm sure you have read it or seen, but otherwise I can find the title.
Yeah, but it's good to have a external validation. What I also did is I used these rep risk scores basically, and then I take a look at, do my measures work? And what I found is that these rep risk scores are basically not related to the promises I find. They're relatively strongly related to the performance measure that I have. But in that performance measure, it's even more strongly related to the controversies. So firms with many controversies score very badly on the rep risk thing. It's like reputational damages due to ESG. So it seems to somewhat work, but I can always just plot in green patents and
because they would say why some investors maybe they understand that they're brown, but they say but they do a lot of innovation in green, so maybe that's why they invest in those.
That could very well work. Yeah. Because I can't check engagement and tilting at the same time in this setting. I'm working on that with MIT right now, but it's difficult.
No, but it's not a matter of engagement. It's just like it's the same channel that you're using. But even if I, as an investor, I know that the firm is brown. If the firm is developing more green patents, that's why I invest without any engagement part.
Yeah, that's.
So may I allow myself a last question, because I think that we are in the detail now. The speakers agree to give a host of the presentation as well as contact the email. So I have a question for that, because greenwashing is a very big issue nowadays, because if we compare that ESG about environment, social, and governance issue. But and as you say, we want to have a shortcut to evaluate, to decide what we can do. So we look at ESG scoring. That is not correct. So in addition to those existing scoring, which are not correct, as you say, so can we somehow use some index of inboxing and point out the unethical practices of rating company like MSCI to avoid greenwashing?
It is possible. So I got an email from BlackRock last week, and we're now talking about the paper. But in principle, what you could always do is also look at the news, because they mainly mention large negative events, because that's their incentive. There's something shocking to tell, then they'll try to tell it. It's not full coverage. Some firms that are larger are more covered in the news, and there's some differences across country, but that's one way to do it. It's not practical. And if you're a pension fund investing in 4,000 titles, then you just can't. But what you could do is buy the underlying data of Refinitiv and then use the underlying information or other proxies of just greenhouse gas emissions, or and always compare apples with apples. Go within industry, not across industry, because depending on what your preference is, you still need to have some sort of energy that will always be more polluting than tech. But if we completely abolish the energy industry, then we also kill the economy and it doesn't work anymore. So buying the ones that have more innovation on that, or that are really trying to change, might have a bigger impact than just buying the ones that are doing well.
So I think we start the seminar today. Thank you very much, the great speakers, this guy, think for the issue and the organizer. Thank you for the active participation from our audience now. And although our director of research will have a small closing note.
I was very happy to welcome each of you, and I think we have learned a lot. As for me, I've learned a lot, and I've discovered a lot with a set of very interesting kinds of controversies and debates. I'm sure that this kind of field needs to be explored, and I would like to thank really, really cheerfully each of you, each intervenant, because I was really appreciating what you have been doing, even though I'm not a financial person. So that's I got it. I managed sometimes to connect things and so on. As my colleague, we try to articulate things with also quality and the possibility to evaluate performance, inner quality of companies, and the possibility to articulate. I'd like also to thank Professor Tam and FBNet and Professor Zhang Fan, who has been they have been very eager to organize this seminar, and I think it's a very important moment, and I'm sure we will move on and go on in that direction, and we'll meet again in other circumstances. Thank you to everybody, and thank you for your participation. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you much, Renaud, and thank you again to our all speaker and audience who joined our seminar today. Hope you enjoy it, and if you have further questions, feel free to contact our speaker, and our speaker will answer you. And also, they are happy to share the PowerPoint with you. Thank you again. Would you mind if you open your camera if you can, so we can take photos of our seminar today? We have a great attendance today.
Interesting, the idea, I'm sure we need to be, as far as we need to be here. That's or otherwise I'm going. Let you sit down, and I'm going to be here. Please take a seat.
Sure. They want us to do it like this, so that
voilà. That's maybe the
Okay.
Yeah, we can see.
In the mirror with this kind of
somewhere here, right?
a bit of size, and then
Everybody stand up, and then we
sit down here.
Yeah, we can see you all now. Okay, are you ready? Let me take a photo then. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Yeah, I got photo from my side. Okay, let me take another one then. One, two, three. Okay. Yeah, I got it. Thank you, everyone. Thank you all speaker. Thank you all audience. Thank you very much for joining our seminar today. And hope you have a nice rest of the day. Thank you.
My mobile phone, please. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, we've got a buffet now, so we can share a little.